Happy Friday. We have a great episode today. It's a conversation with Devin, Devore, and Barrett Bergen, two men around Knoxville, Tennessee in 2016 when polygamy skepticism had a sort of heyday there. They're going to tell us about that experience. Particularly, it's associated with the very first paper in the 21st century, in this era, focused on Joseph Smith monogamy, on polygamy skepticism. And so, very interesting conversation. I hope you watch it. If anyone's seen my hat, let me know. My friends, I am stoked to have Barrett Bergen and Devin Devore join us today. Devin, you start us off, my friend.
Sure. Yeah. I attended law school between 2010 and 2013. And when I was attending law school, members of our state, we would have these meetings, an official thing, not preside or anything like that. There'd be multiple people there. And we would just, one person would host at their house. We would discuss the gospel and politics, right? Especially the Constitution. Of course, as a law student, I was really excited by that and made really good friends with a lot of people when we had these discussions. And the people in the discussions would have a wide range of political viewpoints and backgrounds. One of the topics we would discuss are, who are the modern day Getty and robbers, right? What are the modern day secret combinations? Because if the Book of Mormon is written for our day, then if we're supposed to be warned about these things, and what are the things going on, right? And that kind of got me exposed into the subculture within LDS conservatism.
This is really interesting. Gaddy and robbers. This is the conspiracy in the Book of Mormon. These are the guys that shut down the society every couple hundred years.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, they're the big enemies, especially towards the latter part of the Book of Mormon. But the issue, though, I think, is when you have these discussions and you wonder about Gaddy and robbers or secret combinations, is that if you're not careful, it can lend yourself into conspiracy theory territory. You would have these discussions, then you would visit these conservative forums, right? And I noticed that the way that people would describe themselves are as awake. And that kind of relates to Ether 824, where a person will, have to awake to your, to an awful situation. And so these people would refer themselves as almost like being awake or awakened because they knew what was going on. They knew what was behind the curtain. They knew what was going on behind the scenes to take away our freedoms, to take away our liberties. And I think when you have this in conjunction with Ezra Taft Benson's talks, especially back in 1972, and he talks about one of the big famous things he says, the stuff going on in the Book of Mormon is not a conspiracy theory, it's a conspiracy fact. And even in the talk, he mentions that everyone should read None Dare Call Conspiracy, which is this John Birch Society publication that came out. That's just, in my opinion, full of all these things you see about the Rockefellers are behind everything, the Birch, all these key figures that are there to take away our freedoms and turn us into a communist socialist state. But I think when you view the gospel through a political lens, right, what can happen is instead of shifting our politics to fit the gospel, we shift the gospel to fit our politics, right? And when you mix that lens or that worldview with President Benson talks regarding conspiracy theories, and you mix it with this idea of who are the modern day Gaddy and robbers, it becomes a breeding ground for conspiracy theories, in my opinion. And I think it can get to the point where it can be rather dangerous.
What's so ironic about how this happens, and it seems to happen over and over again, is on the one hand, I think culturally we are sometimes reticent to dive into all the historical context. When you don't know or understand the historical context that's surrounding these events, then what happens is they're taken in isolation. And so that's why this, fantastic book, Watchmen on the Tower, has a very generous, but, sourced approach to President Benson's opinions and approach as an apostle in the larger context of what was happening from his own first presidency and fellow apostles. And when people dig through these talks and these opinions President Benson had in isolation through a very tense, politically charged time period, it seems to oftentimes create this sort of awakening kind of mentality that then ironically turns said group or person against the institution on the very basis of the things that they inherited from it. If President Benson is going to be cited on the basis of the idea that Brigham Young and the apostles and the brethren started plural marriage and stole the church away from the righteous, libertarian-leaning Joseph Smith, all of a sudden you are now questioning the authority by which you got the idea in the first place. It's recursive, it's circular.
I'll be honest with you, I like this conspiracy stuff. And I love Benson's Book of Mormon material. He gave this talk once, and it includes a story about when Heber J. Grant tells him a story about the one mean thing Brigham Young ever did. And Ezra Taft Benson said, I was shocked because I was sure Brigham Young never did a mean thing. And so I just mentioned that to say Ezra Taft Benson, super pro Brigham Young.
Well, I think Benson would be horrified to see how his talks and sermons have been weaponized. The groups who are doing this stuff, right, they're going apostate, or they are apostate. And I think President Benson would be horrified to see how his talks are being weaponized that way. We talk about, his most famous talk is the Pride Cycle, right, and the Pride in the Book of Mormon. And yet what's so fascinating to me is that those who would describe themselves as awake, the idea is because you're awake because unlike every other member of the church who doesn't see what's going on, we actually do. So it wasn't like being awake compared to other religions, other denominations, other people. It was being awake within the members of the LDS church. The Republicans, Democrats, mainstream, they were asleep to what's going on, right? They didn't know what was really happening, but I'm awake. I see the real threats. I see what's going on. Therefore, I know more than my LDS fellow congregants.
He has to turn you against Joseph Smith himself, because Joseph Smith was at times both seemingly libertarian and free-thinking and democratizing the revelatory experience, and authoritarian in terms of the institutionalization of the church, making it a kingdom with a king, making it a structure and order and a priesthood.
Joseph Smith was really big on federal protections, right? That was the big thing, was he felt like the federal government under the Constitution should have been able to provide recourse for Missouri and whatnot. And so the whole libertarian mindset of a very limited federal government is what kept the saints from being able to have any recourse. If you try and use figures to justify political stance, I think you're, especially in history, you're going to end up disappointed. It's just, you can't really drive the two. The people who are using Benson's talks to create these narratives are doing the things that Benson warned against. He was correct. He was very loyal to the gospel and to the church. So the church kind of went through a floodgate, right, of releasing historical transparency. And I really feel like Rough Stone Rolling was kind of this turning point of making a very transparent historical record, right? And the Joseph Smith papers and everything else. And so Bushman just said, look, when all this stuff came out, like everyone had to go through a paradigm shift, not just members, but also leaders as well, right? Everyone had to make this paradigm shift. And that started just a flurry of conversations about how we view history, how we approach history. And during those conversations, that's when I first became aware of this idea that Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy. And as we're having this conversation, I thought a lot of the similar things that we discussed or that were in our conversations about the government and its combinations were a lot of the similar kind of the points that were raised as to Joseph Smith's practice polygamy, right? Intellectual dishonesty, this narrative by this institution, hidden agendas and things like that. Because remember, I'd asked every trained historian who's researched this, looked into this, both in the church, outside the church, RLDS, they've all come to the same conclusion. You know how much easier it would be if Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy? That would make life so much easier.
I think church would have preferred that at times.
Oh, yeah.
But it came down to, and again, doctoring, because the big thing was like the Temple Law affidavits and how we can't trust them because they're made years later and they're not contemporary. I remember saying, okay, let's take all that aside. Let's say you're right. We can't trust them. What about DNC 132? And what's then gone to, okay, well, that was all made up, right? And again, this idea of hidden agendas, doctoring document, it was like a corrupt institution. And again, I want to make a point very clear that, like, the people I have these conversations with, like, they are my friends. We've had our disagreements. We've discussed our disagreements. And so I'm not going off against the people. I'm talking about, we have very differing viewpoints of this historical concept of polygamy, right?
We should cut people out of our lives because they have different ideas than we do on politics or history or even religion.
And just to build on what Devin's saying too, I know who some of these individuals are, and these are very intelligent people. And the thing is that it is not an unnatural instinct to think conspiratorially. I think that is why it's so productive to bring up some of these other examples that we might all chortle at, when there would be plenty of people who would go to the grave defending what they have as a sort of confirmation bias. And like at a certain level, if you feed into that sort of thinking all the way down the rabbit hole, and I think everybody does it to some extent, it'll eat your brain. But this is why I personally, know that it's so important to trust, and not just trust blindly, but understand academic processes and understand why these conclusions are derived, especially with an objective approach. Who could have been more biased in wanting this to be one way than the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? But running into the problem, you can either double down, and you will always find reasons and compelling, logical sounding arguments for any view. Being skeptical and being objective are not the same thing. You can be skeptical, but skeptical about things that are otherwise demonstrable and proven. And this is why we see some backsliding in kind of public common sense and awareness spaces under the guise of waking up. Like Jonathan Haidt, if you're familiar with The Righteous Mind and his understanding and research on how we make decisions on morality, decisions on religion, decisions on politics, the overwhelming evidence is that more intelligent people are not more objective. They're just better at justifying their own BS to themselves. Our brains are very good at this, and that we kind of make intuitive, emotional decisions before we ever approach our justifications. And it's why you have to engage with context, with historical context, and with the larger picture. And that brings me to my second point. I was arguing with somebody about this idea that Brigham Young changed certain journals or something, that like, oh, Brigham had this adjusted. And this person said, ergo, that means, and it's like, that doesn't mean anything. Brigham could have changed 5,000 journals, and it doesn't mean this didn't happen.
I think that's the thing, right? Because denying that Joseph practiced polygamy, I would say that's not a reasonable conclusion to make, but I think it's an enticing one. But you still got to deal with everything that comes after the fact, right? What does that mean with the church? And that's the thing I think is, look, yes, there's evidence that things that were changed. Again, go back to the October 5th, 1843 journal, right? The original journal entry of Willard Richards has not been changed, but the history and everything published, right, was a little different with added language. And so it's easy to come to a conclusion, right? If you leave the viewpoint of hidden agendas, corrupt institutions, forcing this narrative, right? The Brighamites and everything, that is this insidious means. But then, okay, let's look at context. Those changes were made by Thomas Bullock. Thomas Bullock was Joseph Smith's personal clerk and scribe in 1843, right? So as he's going through, it could also very well have been that because all it says is that Joseph Smith gave instruction, but we don't know who that instruction was given to. We have no documents showing what was about, right? He could have very well been there, and as he's going through, he could have looked at it and said, hey, Willard Richards left some stuff out that I was there, and here's some of that added context. He could have had some other notes he was looking at. So it could have been that Thomas Bullock was adding information that Willard Richards left out. It also could have been the fact that Thomas Bullock was adding information to make it more congruent with Jacob 2:30, because the leaders of the church, even Joseph Smith, were not above modifying language, especially in Revelations, to make them more congruent with each other. So there's other plausible reasons that are not insidious to explain why certain things were changed. When the whole premise is built on this conspiracy theory, you just have to build upon conspiracy theory to make this narrative work, really. And that's when you take and strip everything else away. That's really what the premise is. And I think that same premise is the same premise among these certain subcultures of the LDS tradition, among what I would say awake Latter-day Saints, right? Or this awake movement. There's one conspiracy theory about the government and one conspiracy theories about the church.
Devin, thank you so much for that. Barrett, you take me back to the past there. And what year are we starting in?
Yeah, so 2016, I was a year off my mission, and I've always been very interested in church history and the sciences. And when I was a teenager is when digging into church history was not quite, I guess, maybe in vogue as mainstream as it is now, and there was some trepidation around it. And I always found that my testimony was enhanced by taking a more holistic approach, by challenging the paradigm that I had maybe had and coming around ultimately to a more maybe, I feel like this word's been hijacked by the ex-Mormon community, but like a more nuanced space, one that completely upholds and cherishes and values belief in the institution and Jesus Christ and in the restoration, but leaves a lot of room for the complexity and the historical nuances and the things that might make us uncomfortable as the kind of mainstream approach to the culture, which, as Devin put it, with Rough Stone Rolling, I think really the New Mormon history kind of began some of this, but like we have to grapple with the facts. John Adams said facts are stubborn things. And I find that if it's factual and if it's largely demonstrable, then it's part of the truth. And if the gospel incorporates truth, then your theology and your testimony and your faith will only be enhanced by those things. And I found that to be the case. It was more complicated and maybe different. And that was something that I had with me on my mission and after my mission. And like, that was my approach. I wasn't coming back particularly unfamiliar with these issues. And friends of mine in the stake who had been older than me and leaders while I was in youth, who were involved in some of this speculation, was really close to them. I became aware of it, and they reached out to me, and I became introduced to kind of this idea of engaging with history in a complex way, and that this is what these figures were doing. And I became aware of some of the, I didn't realize it at the time, but what I have come to learn was some of maybe the original new polygamy skepticism arguments that were being put forward. And it didn't seem new to me because I was familiar that the RLDS church had already gone down this road and that some people had thought this, and that I had even grown up, knowing that there were Latter-day Saints who had not heard of Joseph Smith practicing plural marriage, which I thought was bonkers because it's right there in the Doctrine and Covenants, but that culturally we didn't necessarily do ourselves any favors by not talking about it. And so I was really refreshed that there was at least a group kind of engaging, but that's kind of all I knew. I became aware that this kind of polygamy skepticism was coupled with, let's call it, more conspiratorial and more kind of apostate thinking, and that it was tied to Denver Snuffer, which of course this original document I read is something that was picked up by him and his group and circulated.
So what was the original document?
Speculative analysis of Joseph Smith essentially practicing monogamy rather than polygamy. And I do remember that it was a kind of an introduction to this question. A fair question, I suppose, to ask, but one based already on an ideology, which the ideology was essentially, you have to accept that somebody was lying, that either Joseph Smith or Brigham Young was lying. And isn't it easier to accept that Brigham Young was lying than Joseph Smith, because at least you have this figure that is untainted by having lied? And I found that really like irrelevant. There's all kinds of lying already in the Bible, and Joseph Smith isn't Jesus Christ. And whether or not he is this perfect like figure has nothing to do with a theology based around Jesus Christ. In fact, it's more consistent with the Book of Mormon itself that talks about the Lord using small and simple means and great things coming to pass. And even the stories we hear about Joseph's life, where people thought Hiram was the more reverent prophetic figure, or things you hear about Joseph that you already know, that he had this huge temper and sometimes had an ego and blew up at people easily and then forgave easily. And he's just this character. And it didn't necessarily cause major alarm. I just immediately became uninterested in that speculation because that just seemed like such a far cry from what we already know about Joseph Smith. And then it was around COVID and years later, and I didn't put two and two together. I did know that Denver Snuffer's group latched onto that, among other things. There's a great Salt Lake Tribune article about tracking what was happening at that time, around then 2017, but sending figures to do like their own sacraments and their own baptisms and a church within a church. And then it was around the 2020s that this sort of picked up, and I have a relative that kind of went down this rabbit hole, and it almost split her family apart because she became so obsessed with the idea that Joseph couldn't have done this. And of course, then you have to lose parts of the temple, and it's, oh, then maybe what is the temple then? And I have another relative that is not at all conspiratorial, but she struggles with this history. And so I guess my response to that ideology would be an ideological question in itself, which is, what is easier, to shift your paradigm and square it with something that, like a rock, is there, and understand that it has all kinds of precedent in all kinds of religious history, or to try to bend reality until you can shape it into sort of the Joseph Smith figure, or let's be honest, the God figure that you want it to be? And so as it started to cause more and more concern, and only recently did I learn that there was a through line with my experience in Knoxville and what the end result of all of that was, which was a lot of hurt feelings, a lot of passion and gusto that this is something that needs to be shared, coming from a good place, a faithful place. And then eventually, as Devin mentioned, apostasy, because that's what it is. If you build a church underneath another church, then eventually you're something new. And no judgment on that. There are plenty of break-offs of the restoration, but let's just call a spade a spade. At a certain point, it does become a religious question. And it is the institutional view that Doctrine and Covenants 132 is canon scripture. And I think it's easier to grapple with it and interpret it and try to understand it, even with its harsh and, some could say barbaric sounding language, which is, again, all over all the scriptures, and grapple with that and what that means in context and through an interpretive lens. I think it's incumbent upon a Latter-day Saint to do that rather than a kind of desperate character analysis of Joseph Smith, because I actually don't think it matters. I don't even think it matters whether he practiced it. I mean, I believe he did 100%, but I think obsessing over that as sort of the linchpin of where it all goes one way or the other doesn't mean anything. If we're going to apply that kind of reasoning to well, did he write it, or did William Clayton write it, or then did Brigham Young write it? Are you then going to apply that same kind of reasoning to the four Gospels and who actually wrote the Gospels, or who actually wrote, the 5 books of Moses? Are you familiar with the biblical scholarship on this? If it's canonized and it's scripture, then really it doesn't come from Brigham Young or Joseph Smith. It comes from God. And that's the harder thing to wrap our heads around. And I think that's the real issue that figures like Jeremy or Michelle admit, is there's an ideological, this couldn't come from God. And that's an axiom. And anytime axioms are leading data, you have an issue. You have that in academia and you have that in religion. And you begin with this axiom.
So I think this is really good. As a Latter-day Saint, when I look at D&C 132, I accept it as scripture, and you use the word barbaric for the language. Some of the language does bother me. I read a little bit like C.S. Lewis reads the Psalms when he talks about coming up with barbaric language there. And he says, I read it as a Christian. And so when I read their time period, I think, wait a second, how should I respond to this, right? And so there's a few phrases, women as property, that makes me really uncomfortable. And so when I read those phrases, I ask myself, how do I want to relate to this? And so I understand the sort of push there.
Of course.
But
It's a productive question.
I think your point that it doesn't matter whether Brigham or Joseph did it is really important to the Latter-day Saint who doesn't already want to put a question mark around Brigham Young. Brigham Young, we've been throwing under the bus for 15, 20 years now. We give it all the bad stuff. We can kind of say, oh, that was Brigham, but not Joseph. And in one case, that's correct. But, there gives us some sort of assurance, some sort of safety in much the way you've spoken. But it really does come down to that, right? Do I think God produced this piece of writing? In this case, they said Joseph did.
One of the things that tipped me off is there was this element of not wanting these discussions or these speculations to be very public.
Secrecy, if you will.
Sure. Yeah. My dad was formerly the stake president of the Knoxville stake. And one of the individuals I remember, and this could have been joking, the comment that was made was like, don't tell your dad about this. I can relate to the feeling of not wanting to be misunderstood and not wanting to be taken out of context. I understand that. But there's an interesting scripture in the New Testament where in reference to Paul and sharing the gospel, an individual says, this thing was not done in a corner. Essentially to suggest that the gospel and it going forth was not this secret kind of conspiratorial, sneaky thing. And I'm at least grateful that the polygamy skeptic movement now is coming forward and saying everything that they feel and think, because at the time that this happened, I think that kind of secret backroom speculations and then spreading those ideas and couching it in secrecy yourself, I think that's just breeding ground for drama and for misunderstanding and frankly for apostasy. I would never be one to squish critical thinking and questioning. I do it myself, and I think it's important. But you look at some of where these radical theories go, and particularly the idea like, I probably shouldn't be saying this or suggesting this, ergo, don't mention it to anybody, especially tied to political or ideological motivations, and the end result is almost always apostasy in the conventional sense. How much more productive to just come out and say what it is you think and grapple with it from the individuals who would most challenge you. That, I think, is useful dialectic behavior.
This is something Brigham Young was complaining about since the 1840s. August 8th, Brigham has his transfiguration experience, his showdown with Sidney Rigdon. 10 days later, on August 18th, he gives a big talk, and it's all about how there are people trying to pull people in different directions in Nauvoo, and they're all saying, don't bring it up to Brigham Young. He's cool with it, but if you tell him, he's going to go against it. And so it's kind of an old tactic of, you're using the word apostasy, right? But of schism or operating a underground movement within an institutional structure. You have to establish those boundaries, and the last thing you want people to know is where the leaders stand on the issues. And
Right.
maybe it's because you don't want to get in trouble, but maybe it's because you don't want them to tamp down on your ability to spread your ideas either.
I think it's complicated, right? Because people do gossip and they misunderstand, and there may be a leader of the church who has a differing opinion than you. It's very understandable. But I think it only fuels the tendency to be suspicious and they go, what's happening here? Why is this so private? You know, if it's something really worth examining, then taking the Ammon approach and going straight to the king and reasoning with the king and the person in power and authority and saying, let's work this out. You have an understanding, I have an understanding, we should look at this. I will be honest, Chris, like our reluctance to even discuss plural marriage, our reluctance to go back and look at some of the sources from when it was practiced other than Joseph Smith. I know our friend Celine is a huge advocate of the women's exponent. And this is years and years of women talking about their experience and how they feel. And when we're going to like censor and silence some questions and discussions and then push others, I think it's only natural that this occurs.
I think the biggest travesty of the polygamy denial movement is just how many women's voices and experience are erased by the whole thing, right? So you talk about this transparency and open up. I've first 50 Years of Relief Society on my bookshelf, right? I read that, and it's just a collection of primary source documents. And it's just one of the best collection of sources I've read. And then also At the Pulpit, right? Which is a collection of sermons by Latter-day Saint women. And these other experiences of women giving healings to each other, prophesying to each other, speaking in tongues. There's these spiritual movements and moments that we just sweep over, either A, because we're not comfortable with the idea of polygamy, so we don't want to touch it, but also B, when we do the polygamy denial movement, say all the women are liars, then we don't want to sit there and read their accounts because we approach it as if they're not telling the truth. And we're missing out on so many just beautiful experiences and moments, just spiritual moments. That whole period, right, is just being erased,
which is ideologically inconsistent when it's like you are hell-bent on making absolutely sure that one or two or three people could never be lying, but these people must always be lying. And if they try to share their own experience, it's like kind of head patty, like, oh, but they're repressed, so what could they know?
I want to believe Emma, right? Her voice and her experience is crucial to this moment, right? To the polygamy. But that doesn't mean that we have to de facto not believe everybody else, right? Because their stories and their experiences are also just as crucial, right? And we can't sit there and apply this skeptic approach to the Utah era while refusing to apply the same approach to the Nauvoo period. You have to assume that everything Joseph wrote publicly was upfront and was honest, and there's no other context, no other undercurrent that was going underneath it, right? And then everything that was said in Utah is suspect. What are the contexts? What is said publicly? What is going on in private? What about the journal entries where Willard Richards wrote in Taylor shorthand that Joseph Smith was sealed, and then Willard Richards was sealed to someone? Well, that's not a contemporary document. Well, that is contemporary. That was written in 1843 or 42? Or, when Zana Young wrote in her journal where her and Presenda Kimball celebrated the anniversary of Priscilla being sealed to Joseph Smith. His journal entry, October 1848, she said, 7 years ago, Priscilla was sealed to Joseph Smith. Many things to reflect upon. Like, do you think she just made that up? Did Brigham Young force her to write that in her journal? You have to assume some type of grand, complex conspiracy to make that argument work.
That kind of conspiracy is unsustainable. Similar to believing in a flat earth. Like, why are all the airline pilots not coming forward like, oh my gosh, I saw the edge of the world and they're trying to pay me to shut me up, but I swear, we give Brigham Young maybe a little too much credit as this authoritarian leader. There was no correlation department. Brigham had his own squabbles with Eliza R. Snow, who he's like, well, I don't know if I approve of what she's saying and such, or like Orson Pratt and trying to push some of his own ideas and theories, and the brother won't agree with me. And yes, he was authoritative. Yes, he was powerful. But again, like looking at historical context, all you need to do is look at the greater Utah period and what Brigham was and wasn't able to pull off. And it just becomes an unsustainable idea. It's a version of history that can work in a vacuum and can kind of work as a story, as a fairy tale. But once you include all of the other context and history, it's not sustainable. There is a lot of opportunity for peace and for understanding and for finding a testimony of the history of plural marriage in the context of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I don't say that of myself. I say that of watching several female friends and family members who have, when actually introduced with the primary sources of the women who lived it, come to peace about this thing and go, oh, okay, now that I can see what was done and how it was done, I can leave it in the past. And my honest to goodness opinion is that the polygamy denial movement has done more to stir this back up and make this more of an issue now than it ever would have been by leaving it in the past, coming to terms with it. In some ways, I'm grateful for that, because at least we can look the thing in the eye and square what it means and how it would and does affect women and men. And it's my belief that if something comes from God, then like the people who lived it and actually experienced it and gained a testimony, it is possible to have at least peace of mind in leaving it in the Lord's hands. And understanding that to the extent that it haunts us, it has no bearing on our lives here and now, other than to come to terms with what actually happened from an objective standpoint. And like most other things, it's only enhanced my testimony to understand and hear the voices of the people who actually knew the truth about what happened with plural marriage.
Love it, Barrett. Thank you. Devin.
I think if you just have this mindset of distrusting institutions, always looking for hidden agendas, attacking those who have dedicated their lives and hours, right, to gaining the training and the methodology to view sources and view history, that is the ultimate result that's going to happen, right? I think it's inevitable. I don't think you can have your feet in both places of, I deny polygamy, but I still believe that the church still has the authority, right? We have to grapple with the idea of polygamy, right? And dealing with it and grappling with it actually ended me at a stronger faith and testimony of the gospel and the work through the historical record.